something strangely serene, yet haunting about being in pitch-black wilderness. Deer season in the panhandle of Texas means you're awake early and in position before light even just barely begins to turn the sky from an empty void to the deep purples and reds of a beautiful sunrise. Wearing layers to help fight off the freezing cold winds that seem to penetrate down into your bones, you do your best to keep your teeth from chattering, using the dream of that perfect buck as just another layer of warmth to keep your focus. The risk versus reward always seemed a little lopsided out here, as I shivered uncontrollably. I was always an early bird when it came to hunting. The sun wouldn't rise for a couple hours when I arrived at my hunting grounds. This was perfect. Plenty of time to make my way down this particular game trail that led to the river, splitting the valley down the middle. The night vision scope on my rifle was as good as one could hope for when it came to navigating under the new moon. I had learned my lesson and got some big rubber boots to wear in the water. It was cold enough without my feet being soaked in this shallow but frigid stream. Sitting on the muddy bank, I took my hiking boots off and tied them to my backpack. Slipping on the rubber boots and taking extra care not to trip in the sticky mud, I carefully made my way against the current for a couple hundred yards. Minimizing sound isn't easy when every splash from your footsteps feels like a thundering crash. There was one particular spot I wanted to place my container of doe estrus scent. After some trial and error, I realized the harsh winds blowing down the valley could be used to my advantage, maximizing the distribution of the scent, and thus maximizing the potential for drawing in some nice bucks that only have one thing on their mind this time of year. I'd seen plenty of bucks chasing after a doe, and I always chuckled at the fact that he didn't have to catch up to her, he just needed to keep up. That hormone-fueled tunnel vision was exactly what I was counting on. The water was used like a highway by nearly every animal around there. The grass on the valley floor, sometimes towering over me, and I'm 6 feet tall, combined with the debris of fallen trees and cactus, made even the animals think twice about walking through it unless they absolutely needed to. The hundreds of footprints, varying from a few minutes to a few days old, confirmed that theory for me. The wind would carry the scent and channel it along the water. Old Bucky McDeerface would catch that aroma and be powerless to resist the temptation. Upon reaching the spot, confirming through my scope that I was in the right place, I poured out the estrus. Gosh, does that stuff stink? Get it on your hands or clothes, and you're not gonna have a fun time. Now it was time to walk back the way I came, climb out of the water, switch back into my hiking boots, and begin the trek to the overlook where the sight was unmatched. I was proud of my little hide. 110 yards from where I sat to the muddy bank, where I deployed the scent, according to my rangefinder. Situated between some boulders, I was somewhat shielded from the pelting wind. The line of sight was clear, so there was little worry about missing anything. Ascending the steep hill was a taxing endeavor, mostly because there were 2 hills to get over before I would be in place. As I walked, I periodically scanned my rifle around me, using the night vision to stay on track and try to get an idea of what was around me. Sometimes the infrared illuminator attached to the scope would pick up some eyes shining at me, only visible through the small screen, carefully covered to prevent showing too much light. Usually, it was a deer or a coyote, and occasionally a pack of coyotes, likely doing the same thing I was, surveying the land to begin the hunt. At least they knew to keep their distance. Discouraging the curious with a bullet through the brain was plenty to make sure they left me alone after the last time I'd found one of the pack getting too close for comfort. Once I was in place, there wasn't really any practical way to sneak up on me. Between the steep decline to the bottom of the hill and the loose gravel going uphill at my back, I felt pretty safe. After what felt like an eternity of slowly making my way to my spot, I could finally catch my breath and squeeze tightly between the boulders, doing my best to stay awake until I'd be legally allowed to take a shot. Staring through the scope, I could clearly see the river and about 100 yards beyond it in a fairly wide area, thanks to the range of the IR light. Anything that fell in the range of the light was what I considered a safe shot, close enough to ensure a clean kill, but far enough to not be spotted. It was after maybe 15 minutes of waiting that I heard an odd sound. It almost sounded like a laugh or some kind of gibberish, but that couldn't be right. I was the only person out here, so what made that sound? Coyotes didn't sound like that. Their barks and yelps could be heard a long way off, and this was different. No way it was a deer either, at least not any deer that could be found around here. It put me on edge a little, but I tried to rationalize whatever it may or may not have been. A few minutes later, it happened again, this time clearer, like a hyena making that laughing sound. No hyenas around here, at least I thought so. Trying to get over, being jittery, I kept looking through the scope. It would be a while longer until it was light enough to shoot. But that's when I saw the eyes looking at me, down on the bank at the edge of the tall grass. It didn't move a muscle, and neither did I, until another set of eyes blinked into existence. Behind me, there was noise. Oddly enough, there was a voice that sounded like Baby Groot, that small kind of scratchy voice, but it was entirely unintelligible. I took a deep breath and held it, trying to will the wind to quiet down so I could listen closely. There was another small sound, something like a reply to the other voice. This got me nervous. Two sets of eyes, locked on me down below, and two distinct sounds behind me, up the hill and over the crest a little. This is a good time to say the rifle I had with me was my AR-15, with 2 full mags and a pistol in my backpack with 2 mags as well. I had 60 rounds of 5.56 and 30 rounds of 9mm. Why so much for hunting? Because I can and I felt like it. Plain and simple. Throw in a good-sized Bowie knife, and safety from any animal felt like the least of my problems. Anyway, attached to my rifle was a laser and light designator. The laser was green and in the visible spectrum of light, with a range of over 600 yards when used in the dark. More than a few times, I had used it to mess with a raccoon or a possum to pass the time. Watching them scurry after the green dot was quality entertainment. It also worked well as a deterrent if I managed to put the dot into an eye, not to do any permanent damage, because I'm not a cruel person, but just enough to give whatever creature it was the chance to go away if needed. I say all this to explain what I was about to do. As the minutes passed, I could hear the little voices behind me growing louder and more diverse, at least 4 different voices now. Down below at the edge of the grass, I could make out 3 more sets of eyes through my scope. That made 5 of varying heights, none of them very tall, with the biggest maybe 3 feet, judging by the grass. They never wavered in the slightest, even as they shifted a few feet left or right. It felt like things were getting out of hand. I was being closed in on from behind, and given the steep gradient of the hill, I didn't have anywhere to go. I had to try something, anything, to get away safely. That was where the laser came in. I didn't want to shoot unless I absolutely had to because it was still too dark, and the last thing I wanted was to explain a gunshot to a random game warden. Unless I could clearly prove it was self-defense, I might end up facing a heavy fine for taking an animal before shooting ours. With those consequences in mind, I slid my left hand forward and found the button to activate the laser. In the darkness, a bright green dot flared to life, and I carefully moved it toward one of the eyes. As soon as the laser blended with the shine of the eye, a horrendous scream tore through the air. It made me jump. It was so loud. Then screaming erupted from behind me too. Everything was happening in unison, and the noise was deafening. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The valley fell quiet again. Maybe 30 seconds went by before I heard a tap next to me. It sounded like a small rock hitting one of the boulders. Then another and another. Rocks began streaming in, bouncing off the stones, thudding against my legs and back. Luckily, thanks to the cold, I was wearing multiple layers, so the hits were just light thuds, but it was still terrifying. They were hurling rocks in a torrent. I took a deep breath and prepared for part 2 of my brilliant plan. Gripping my rifle like a lifeline, I stood up as fast as I could, bringing the scope to my eye and turning to face the top of the hill. I couldn't see anything except rocks flashing briefly in the infrared as they launched high into the air toward me. Thinking it was either a good idea or a terrible one, I charged up the hill, stumbling over rocks and brush but keeping my eye locked on the scope. Out of breath, but at the crest, I hit the button for the light and scanned everywhere, frantically searching for whatever was throwing the rocks. Everything went dead still. I scanned left, right, forward, and back but saw nothing. Spotting the path I had used to climb up, I took off in a careful jog, doing my best not to fall. From behind me, the screaming and rock throwing started again. After finding a spot that looked like decent cover, I made myself as small as possible and took aim up the hill. Rocks pinged around me, some bouncing off my rifle, some even hitting my head. I waited to see a set of eyes appear, ready to put a bullet between them. But no eyes showed. With no target, I decided to get the hell out of there. The screams turned into a maniacal cackling that reminded me of the creatures from the movie Gremlins. That was all the motivation I needed to keep running. Eventually, the rocks stopped, but the laughter continued. It followed me all the way back to my truck. The last glimpse I got was when I cranked the engine and the headlights pierced the blackness. 9 pairs of eyes reflected back from just inside the grass and brush. After making sure I hadn't left anything behind, I shifted into drive, smashed the gas, and spun the wheel, sending a spray of gravel in their direction. Whether it hit them or not, I didn't know, but it made me feel better as I sped down the road, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Whatever they were, they felt predatory, moved extremely fast, and coordinated frighteningly well. In a blink, the hunter had become the hunted. This is my first time publicly telling this story. It almost sounds like the generic monster in the woods story, but I've held on to it for a few years now, and I'm ready to tell it. I live in the hill country of Texas, and this event happened back in August of 2018. Pinky promise it's true. As anyone in Texas can tell you, August is usually miserably hot. The summer is what I like to call Diet August, and for good reason. I worked as a maintenance tech for a school district, so heat and manual labor were my best friends. One of my buddies called me one day around lunchtime, and he told me there was a problem at his family's ranch. Apparently, one of the horses had gotten loose and ran off the evening before and hadn't returned, so he asked if I would be able to help look for it. It was Friday, and I didn't have any plans, so a trip to the ranch sounded like a great way to spend the weekend. A few hours later, I got another call. This time I was told they found the horse, dead, and that we would be going on a predator hunt. For those that may not know, there aren't exactly many large predators around here. Plenty of coyotes and wild pigs, and very rarely a mountain lion. But that's about it unless someone has some exotic stuff on their land, which isn't too uncommon. One time, I saw a zebra chilling under an oak tree while driving down some winding back road. When I got off work, I went home and immediately got changed into some hunting clothes and prepped my gear. At the time, I had an SKS, which usually worked just fine. Ammo was cheap and plentiful. Figuring we would probably need some quick follow-up shots, it would do the job. With a big sharp Bowie knife to hang on my belt, I felt ready for whatever would happen. My friend picked me up, and we drove for about 2 hours before we finally arrived at his family's ranch. The ranch was beautiful. Thick forest, rolling hills, tons of wildlife. I often joked that I could strip naked and wander off like a Bedouin in the desert and be totally content. The basic layout was the main house situated down a dirt road that took several minutes to navigate, so it was set pretty far from any roads. About 100 yards from the house was the barn where most of the equipment was kept. A couple of ATVs and a cool little side-by-side that was always a blast to drive. There was a pasture where the horses were generally kept, but aside from that, the area was just wild land. Trails had been cut or ridden on so many times that they formed very reliable means of exploring. When we got out of the car and got my stuff unloaded, I was told we were waiting on a couple more people to show up. Fine by me. The more the merrier, I thought. In the meantime, I was told to go to the barn and see what was left of the horse that had been retrieved from the forest. That scene was not something I expected, although I really didn't know what I would expect to see. It was torn to ribbons. Deep slash marks covered the body. The stomach was torn open, and I could see tooth marks where something had taken bites, but it didn't seem like it had been fed on. More like demolished in a fit of rage. That ruled out coyotes instantly. Even if a pack was strong enough to take this horse down, they would have done their best to pick it clean. It also couldn't have been pigs. There were no signs of injury on the lower legs that might indicate tusks. That either left some maniac roaming the woods or a mountain lion. The lion, rare as they might be, looked like the culprit. It broke my heart to think we'd have to kill it. I'd have rather found a way to remove it and take it somewhere safe, but if it's taking down horses, it would have no problem taking down a human. The sun was slowly getting lower in the sky when the other guys showed up. I won't use their names, of course, but there were 4 of us. We discussed options for searching and decided that a grid search using maps of the ranch would be our best bet. However, with so much land to cover, we would each take an area to sweep. Every 10 minutes, we would have a radio check to make sure we were safe. One of my favorite things about coming here was that there was some pretty awesome stuff we could use during our shenanigans. Chief among them, tonight, would be sets of night vision goggles. I chose the monocular with the head mount so I could have one eye available to see regularly. One thing about using night vision is the lack of depth perception, and I'm not keen on tripping over every bump on the ground. We chose our grid to search, checked our gear, tested the radios, and we were off. By our 3rd radio check, I was finally in place to start searching. I took out the map, used my compass to situate myself, and picked a direction to walk. The sun was real low by now, and was already near pitch black under the canopy of oak and cedar and other various trees. With the night vision over my eye, I slowly crept through the brush, trying my best to make as little noise as possible. From the sound of it, I was the only creature being quiet. The forest was teeming with all the nocturnal critters beginning their nightly activities. Raccoons, opossums, cottontail, and jackrabbits. Of course, you can't forget about the bugs. The constant chattering of cicadas mixed with crickets and whatever else makes noise gave the area an almost deafening feeling. Slowly, I scanned the area with the night vision, rifle in the low ready position, and my breathing as calm and quiet as one can manage. 2 radio checks went by when I suddenly realized that the woods had gone quiet. Standing alone at night in a forest that should be full of noise that no longer has noise is a frightening thing. Generally, animals will go quiet when danger is nearby. Problem was, nothing seemed to care about my presence, and now there was dead silence. I made my way to a clearing and found a tall hill. It looked like a good vantage point to get my bearings, so I climbed the fairly steep slope. At the top, I had as close to a commanding view as one could hope when surrounded by tall trees. In any direction, I was maybe 20 to 25 yards from the tree line. The sun was down, with the last glimmer of purple and red sinking below the horizon. Navigating was about to get a bit more difficult. Using the night vision, I tried to pick out any landmark I could see to figure out where I was on the map. Swinging my head around, I could see a reflection of eyes in the trees from the infrared emitter of the goggles. They were big and bright and unblinking. I stared for a moment, deciding what I should do. I could see pretty well in the clearing, thanks to the moonlight and the IR, but in the tree line was an impenetrable blackness. I called out to the eyes, trying to get whatever it was to move so I could see it better. I could tell it was taller than a deer, or basically anything else that lived there, so I thought it was a person. Suddenly, I was really wishing it was a mountain lion. Horse-mutilating psycho was not what I wanted on my hunting bingo card. I called out and said, "Hey, this is private land. You need to leave right now." Nothing happened for maybe 30 seconds when I heard the eyes speak. It said, "Leave right now," in a perfect impression of my voice, as though it was a recording. Safe to say, that was extremely unsettling. I raised my rifle and said, "If you don't leave right now, you're going to die." At this, the eyes lifted as though they had stood up. The height, from my best guess, was maybe 7 or 8 feet, depending on how tall the tree next to it was. Then it moved, stepping out of the darkness and into view of my night vision. It repeated my words again, saying, "You're going to die." For a moment, I was in shock. This thing looked sickly white, maybe gray. It had a long and slender frame. Without a second thought, I pulled the trigger and fired at it. How I could miss at that distance was a mystery to me, but I fired again, and this time the bullet struck home. The creature let out a monstrously unnatural wail, like a mountain lion's scream mixed with a Wilhelm scream from Star Wars, and maybe an air horn. I was stunned, merely paralyzed with the most primal sense of fear I've ever experienced. Then it took a step toward me. I fired again and again and again, emptying my entire magazine of 20 rounds, but it still kept walking. If I hit it, I didn't know, because it hadn't screamed again. Without taking my eye off of it with the night vision, I fumbled to eject the magazine and was reaching for another when it stopped walking, maybe a yard from me. The creature stood there, staring at me. It didn't have any hair, and its skin looked as though it was merely wrapped tightly around bone, with no muscle or definition. The eyes were small, despite having a massive reflection in the IR. There was a line that I guessed was probably the mouth. I stood there, not knowing what to do. It raised a hand toward me, and then I saw the fingers. There were 4 fingers, long and black, tapering down to something like an ice pick. That's when the smell hit me. It was like hot vomit, pungent with the odor of decay and feces. In my brain, I knew I had to get away from it, but I physically couldn't move. Just before the fingers made contact with my shoulder, there was this moment of clarity, and I was able to move. With a fluid motion, I dropped my rifle from my hands, falling across my chest, and being caught by the sling, and with my right hand, I drew out the Bowie knife. A few months before, I had gotten bored and decided to modify the knife a little. I had ground an edge from the tip to the serrations on the blunt side of the blade so that I could cut in either direction. I slashed upward from the creature's right hip toward the left shoulder. It screamed and took a step back. This was my moment to run. I stepped backward and fell down the side of the hill, rolling and flailing as I tried to not drop the knife and keep my rifle from being too damaged. At the bottom, I rolled to my feet and took off in a flat sprint. Crashing through the brush like a freight train, I could hear heavy steps behind me. I knew if I looked back, I would probably die, so I just kept running and trying to avoid skewering myself on a random branch as they briefly came into view in the night vision, which had miraculously stayed on my head. I'm not the strongest runner, but fear and adrenaline are excellent motivators. Eventually, I came barreling out of the forest and directly into the other 3 guys as they were on their way to me. They started yelling and asking what happened, and I bellowed, "Just shoot!" As I tried to recover, they took my word for it and began shooting into the trees, emptying the mags on their 2 AR-15s and 1 AR-10. As their guns became empty, they helped pick me up off the ground and we started running down the trail and back toward the house. After what felt like an eternity of running, we flew into the house and locked the door. Catching our collective breaths for a minute, we kept shifting our eyes to each other and out the nearest window. Once we felt like we had the air to talk, I explained what had happened. They told me they had heard the shots and started heading in my direction, thinking I had found the mountain lion or was injured trying to signal for help. It was then that I realized I had likely dropped the radio when I fell down the hill, because they said they tried getting me on their radios, but I hadn't answered. It was only after I finished talking that my friend, whose family owns the ranch, said that they'd heard odd things before, but had never tried to investigate. None of us got any sleep that night, keeping watch out the four sides of the house with rifles loaded and ready. Luckily, nothing happened, and we prepared to leave once the sun crested the horizon. The drive home was uneventful and without much conversation. When I got home, I immediately undressed and just took a moment to stare in the bathroom mirror. I had a handful of scrapes and scratches that I hadn't even noticed. My back was sore, and my right ankle felt a little sharp. That shower was one of the greatest feelings I've ever had, and when I was done, I collapsed on my bed and was instantly asleep for the next 15 hours. Coming face to face with that monstrosity was definitely the scariest moment of my life, and I haven't returned since then. It took over a year to finally get comfortable with being in the woods again, though I still get a sinking feeling when I see the sun setting. What was it? I don't know, and quite frankly, I'm not interested in finding out. If we meet again, I'll be sure to have plenty of bullets and a sharp knife. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe to Descent into the Unknown for more horror content. If you have any real cryptid encounters, or you're a horror writer wanting to share your stories, please feel free to email me in the description anytime.